In today's video for coinpoker.com, we're going to be discussing how to play medium strength hands in no limit Texas Hold'em poker. A very common question I get in the comments down below. Go down there, say hi, click the like button, click the subscribe button. Is essentially, I never know when I should call or fold with my marginal medium strength hands. It seems like my opponents always have the nuts when they bet on all three betting rounds. Please help me learn to play these medium strength hands. Well, this is a very, very common problem that many players have because your strong premium hands are usually pretty easy to play. You're trying to get your money in. Your weak hands are also usually pretty easy to play. You're trying to not put all your money in. But what should you do with those medium strength hands that could be way ahead, but at the same time could also be way behind? Well, in this webinar, you're going to learn the importance of determining your opponent's strategy. And from there, you're going to learn how to proceed against tight players or tight ranges, also how to proceed against loose players or loose ranges, and finally, how you should adjust when you're playing heads up compared to when you are playing multi-way. First things first, you always want to consider what your opponent's strategy is. And this is especially true with your medium strength marginal hands because some players will bluff far too often, whereas other players will almost never bluff or will actually never bluff. You're going to want to be far more inclined to call down with your medium strength hands against players who will bluff on some or all betting rounds. That said, other players will have no bluffs either on all betting rounds or specific betting rounds. You'll find some players will raise pre-flop and continuation bet the flop with everything, but then on the turn when they bet again, they just have a really good hand. Or some people will bet the flop and the turn with all sorts of junk, but when they bet the river, they have a very good hand. Also, you'll find that some ranges will naturally have almost no bluffs on specific boards or specific runouts. And for that reason, in some scenarios, you should be inclined to overfold against almost everyone. Also, be aware that just because you know good, strong, fundamentally sound poker, because hopefully you studied at pokercoaching.com and at peakgto.com, that does not mean your opponents have. So you always want to pay attention to how their strategy will differ from the game theory optimal strategy so that you can then make good logical assessments. Let's discuss first how to play against tight players or tight ranges. Ranges can be tight because either a player's range is generally tight because they only like to play good cards, or because a player's position dictates they should be tight. What I mean by this is that many players, when they raise from early position, assuming they're playing well at all, they have to play a tight range from early position. So when a tight player raises from early position, especially if the flop comes with mostly high cards and they want to bet the flop and the turn and the river, unless they are overly loose and aggressive and will find lots of bluffs, that's the spot where you want to be finding very big folds. So if your opponent's generally tight, or if they're forced to be tight because of their poor position, you should generally be inclined to overfold against them. Let's take a look at some examples. Here we have the hijack raising, a very tight player. Now, can we fold the king 10 suited on the button 100 big blinds deep in a cash game? I don't think so. I think even though we could be dominated, this is a spot where we're in position, playing deep stacked. Suited Broadway hands are great to play. We call. Flop comes 10, 8, 6. We have top pair. The hijack bets $12. So you may think, well, we could be beat. I should fold. No. You cannot fold here. A lot of players, especially if they are on the tighter side, will raise with ace, king, ace, queen, ace, jack, king, queen, and then continuation bet it on the flop because they think that's just what they're supposed to do. A very common trait of many small stakes players, both live and online, is that they continuation bet far too often, especially from out of position. Again, if you studied at peakgto.com, you know deep stack you have to check a lot from out of position, especially on low and middle card boards, because this flop will nail the buttons calling range because we're going to call lots of medium suited connected stuff. But a lot of people don't know that. So this is a spot where when they continuation bet, our only option is to call. You may say, should we raise to try to get value and protection? Well, if we raise and they call, we could be crushed, right? And if we raise and they re-raise, it's miserably bad. And if they fold, they were probably drawing to 6 outs or 3 outs. And if your opponent's drawing to 6 or 3 outs from out of position, fine, let them draw, especially if you're going to be able to play a relatively easy strategy on the turn and the river. This time, though, we call. By the way, a lot of people don't realize that when your opponent blasts the flop, your hand is already starting to become close to a bluff catcher. It's better than a bluff catcher. This is a pretty good hand, don't get me wrong. But with your bluff catchers, you almost never want to raise, because if you raise and get called, you usually don't love it. You would much rather play a small or medium-sized pot with your medium strength hands than a large pot with your medium strength hands, because if the pot gets large, your medium strength hands go way down in value. Turns to 6, and now the opponent pots it. They bet $40 into the $40 or $39 pot. 10, 8, 6, 6. Now, at this point, I'm not going to say you should definitively fold, but if your opponent is literally a weak, tight, straightforward player who literally only puts in money in the pot on the turn with a hand they think they are winning with, I think it's pretty reasonable to fold immediately. In this scenario, if you consider what a tight player is going to raise with, they probably don't even have hands like King 9 offsuit or King 7 suited, or maybe not even Ace 7 suited or Ace 9 offsuit. So their only logical bluffs that people would at least consider bluffing with on the turn would be Queen Jack or Jack 9 suited, and some players won't even bet those. But if you consider their value hands, if they have pocket aces, kings, queens, jacks, 10s, 8s, 6s, Ace 10, those hands are all going to continue betting a large chunk of the time. And you lose to all of those. Now, your opponent could be value betting Queen 10, Jack 10, maybe pocket 9s, but there's still a whole lot of other hands that you lose to. And I'm not sure how you're going to play the river, because, I mean, top pair is usually pretty good on the river, but if your opponent wants to jam it in, you don't love it. So if you've watched my content here on YouTube or at pokercoaching.com, you know that I don't really like making big folds, but this is a spot where if your opponent is very, very tight and straightforward, I think folding is reasonable already. We call, though, this time. River's a total blank at 2 of clubs. Your opponent rips it all in for a little bit more than pot. Now, this is just an easy fold. Unless your opponent's the type of player who will take ace, king, ace, queen, ace, jack, king, queen, and just bet the flop, bet the turn, and jam the river, just fold. Now, don't go around letting your opponents know you're making a big fold with the king 10. You don't want them to recognize they can just blast you and you're going to fold one of the best hands you could have. But exploitatively, against a very tight player, this is a spot where you do need to fold your bluff catchers, because your opponent's not going to be bluffing very often. And if your opponent's not bluffing very often or ever, this hand loses more often than not. So find the fold. Feels bad, feels nitty. You don't get to see what they have, but it's what you got to do. Here we have under the gun raising. Under the gun, 80 big blinds deep in a tournament is opening it up. We call in the big blind with the ace 10 offsuit. It comes ace king 7. We check. They bet. Kind of big. Right off the bat, you should recognize this board is way better for the under the gun player than the big blind, because the under the gun player isn't raising a whole lot of hands that don't have something like a pair or a gut shot straight draw at this point. Sure, they may have 9-8 suited, but there aren't a whole lot of combinations of those. That said, we can't go around folding the top pair. Kind of like the king 10 last hand, we don't want to raise, because if we raise and get called or re-raise, it is miserably bad. But if we do call, we can keep them in with queen jack, queen 10, jack 10, sporadic 9-8 suiteds. They're forced to stay in the pot with pairs, like pocket 9s. So we're going to call. Turns a 4. We check. The opponent now pots it. Kind of like the previous spot, this is a very nasty scenario right off the bat. I'm not going to say you should definitively fold, but against a player who is overly tight and overly passive, I think folding is very reasonable in this spot, because a lot of players aren't going to keep betting with their weak aces, and they're also not going to keep betting with their kings. So what are they really bluffing with? I mean, you need them to be bluffing with their gut shot straight draws, like queen 10, queen jack, and jack 10 in this scenario, for a big bet, after you have check called the flop saying you have something. So I don't think most players who are tight and straightforward are doing that. Also, most players from first position don't raise queen jack, queen 10, and jack 10 offsuit. So there aren't even that many combinations of those, because they're only probably playing the suited versions. And yeah, they could have jack 10 of spades and be bluffing you. But again, there's only a few combinations of those. So it's pretty easy to find logical value hands, ace king, ace queen, ace jack, ace 10, which you chop with, but not so worried about that. Pocket aces, pocket kings, pocket 7s, right? And it's kind of hard to find bluffs. This is a spot where exploitatively, I might just fold immediately. If we do call, river's a blank, we check, the opponent goes all in, just an easy fold. This is a spot where, because the opponent raised from early position, it is very, very, very hard for them to have that many bluffs, unless they are playing good, strong, Game 3 optimal poker, and most people do not bluff nearly often enough, so you should overfold your bluff catchers. And at this point, this is a bluff catcher. So let it go. What about if your opponents are too loose instead of being too tight? Well, Players' ranges can be wide because either a player generally plays a wide strategy and they're playing lots of pots because that's what they think they're supposed to do, or because their position, like on the button, dictates they should be playing with a wide range. You're going to find that loose players may play a whole lot of hands that should be folded, assuming they're trying to play well before the flop, and that's even more true in late position. You'll find some players in late position, if it folds to them on the button or the cutoff, they'll raise 75% of hands, and that means they're going to have far too much junk after the flop. So if they're going to have far too much junk after the flop, you in turn should be way more inclined to call them down with your marginal hands. Okay? Note, though, that fundamentally sound players should be raising with a wide range from late position, like 50-ish% of hands or so. So now, because they're raising a lot more medium cards, boards that would normally be very good for them, such as all high card boards, right? If the pre-flop raiser raises, normally high card boards are really good for them. These boards are less good because they're going to have more hands that completely miss the flop. So let's take a look at a few examples here. Here we have the 5-2 suited against a wide, loose player on the button. They raise. We can call. 80 big blinds deep in a tournament with a 5-2 suited. This is fine and good and reasonable. You shouldn't fold any suited hands, really. Jack 5-3. We check. The continuation bet small. We can call or raise at this point. You may say, didn't you just say not to raise medium strength hands? Yes, but you have to realize this medium strength hand is actually very vulnerable to being outdrawn. Consider the ace 10 on the ace king 7. We're really not all that worried about getting outdrawn because if we're already behind, we're just dead, right? Like if they have ace king on the ace king 7 and we have ace 10, we have almost no chance to win. Here, though, whatever the opponent's betting with will win some portion of the time. Say they have 9-8 offsuit, right? You don't really care if the 9-8 offsuit folds. That said, calling is certainly very, very reasonable. You're going to find, though, some of your middle and bottom pairs with junky kickers really don't mind putting in a raise at this point in game theory optimal world, but calling is fine too. Turns of 4. You may think, should we lead? We have a straight draw. We could have a flush. Definitely not. This is a spot where a wide range on the button is going to have 7-6, ace 2, lots of flushes because they're going to raise lots of suited hands. So this is a spot where even though we could have very good hands, so could the opponent. And when you both could have kind of the same amount of very premium hands, you really don't want to be leading from out of position. And that's especially true when you are deep stacked. If you studied and on peak GTO, you know you just don't lead all that often when you're deep stacked from out of position. All right, check. Opponent checks it back. River's a 9. We check. You may say, should we bet small? I don't think so. It's kind of hard to extract value, even if we do bet small in this scenario. But if you wanted to bet one big blind, I think that's probably reasonable. We check, though. And the plan in this spot against a lot of players who raise ranges that are way too wide is to try to get to the showdown. Remember, these players are making the mistake of having too much junk in their raising range before the flop, which is going to result in them having too much junk on the flop and the turn and the river. So, should we call? A lot of people look at this 500 bet and say, oh, they're trying to sucker me into calling. And maybe your opponent is. Maybe your opponent always pots it with their value hands and or pots it with their bluffs and half pots it with their value hands. If that's the case, fold. I don't pretend to know specifically how my opponents play so much to the point that I know that half pot means nuts and pot means bluff. But if you do know that about your particular opponent, maybe you can make an exploitative fold. But in general, against players whose ranges are just far too wide, I'm going to call here because lots of 8 high, 10 high, queen high, king high will feel pretty inclined to bluff on the river to try to get you to fold out a 5 or a 4 or a 3. So we call. They have the queen 10 offsuit. Great. Let's take a look at another one. Here we have a loose player raising with a wide range. We have pocket 8s. We call. In the cutoff, 100 big blinds deep in a cash game. Queen, queen 7. They bet small. Easy call in position. Turns a 9. They bet small again. Okay. Against small bets, you really can't go around folding all that often, and that's especially true against wide ranges. You may say, my opponent's betting small to try to sucker me in. Again, a lot of people think that. And maybe they are, maybe they aren't. It's hard to know. Some people just bet small because they don't want to face a big bet, or they don't want to check and just give up. So this is a spot where, even though we, of course, could be in very bad shape, against a wide, loose range, without any other read about bet sizing, this is just an easy call. Also, the small bet could just be with a 7, right? Or pocket 3s. River's a 10, and now the opponent bets 22. I don't love this spot. This is a spot now where a lot of the busted draws came in. However, if you consider the opponent's range, they could easily have a lot of ace-x suited and king-x suited that we beat. They could also have low-suited connected hands if they are too wide. And a lot of players, when they bet the flop and the turn like this, they're not really going to have a 9, right? Because a 9 may bet the turn small, but probably isn't going to blast the river. And if they added 10, they may not also blast the river. I realize blast is perhaps a bit of an overstatement, 22 into 37. And I do want to make it clear, it's hard to know specifically what your opponents are doing. I can't say that this particular bet size means anything in particular. That said, I do think this is an okay spot to find a hero call if you are sure your opponent will bet the flop and the turn and the river too wide, because you've been paying attention and you've seen them splashing around hard in an aggressive manner. So this is a spot where I think naturally this is probably a fold in game theory optimal world. It's close at least. But against someone who's going to just bluff with way too much ace-x, king-x, and nonsense, you just got to call. We do call, and this time they have king 5 of clubs. Total junker. It's going to happen. Don't be shocked when they show up with this. Now let's discuss how to play multi-way pots. Most players, in general, bet with polarized ranges in multi-way pots, but they usually don't find quite enough bluffs or junky hands, which are usually going to be with their draws. So when most people are betting in multi-way pots, assuming they've studied poker and they're decent, they're usually going to be too value heavy. So if they're too value heavy, you want to fold out your bluff catchers, which will be lots of medium strength hands. It may feel a little bit weak to call pre-flop and have a few more people call, and then you flop some sort of marginal pair, and you face a bet and you just let it go. But that's very often what you should do. When you face a bet and a call, you need to be way more inclined to fold your marginal hands, because you're usually going to be very, very dominated, and you don't necessarily know which way you're going to be dominated. We'll take a look at an example in just a second. You'll also find the position is very important in multi-way pots. When you have players behind you who have yet to act, you have to be way more careful and fold hands that would call if you were heads up, because if you call, the players yet behind you can call, or even worse, raise, and force you to fold out whatever equity you have. That said, if you're closing the action and everybody else is folded between you and the bettor, you can call more often than if there were players yet to act. But, this is very important, be aware that the bettor should be betting with a tighter range compared to when they are playing in a heads-up pot, because multi-way, when they're betting, they need to have a very strong range. Just because multi-way, you have to be concerned that one of the many players yet to act has something really good. Let's take a look at some examples. Here we have the ace-8 suited. Under the gun raises, hijack calls, button calls, small blind calls, big blind, we call. Jack 8-7, check, check. Under the gun checks, hijack bets small, 1/5 pot. By the way, in multi-way pots, you often do want to use smaller bet sizes. We discuss this thoroughly in the tournament and cash game masterclass at pokercoaching.com. Because again, you very rarely have a huge nut advantage, because everyone can have the 10-9 suited and everybody can have the 8s and the 7s. So this is a spot where it is, all the players' ranges are kind of all on top of each other when it comes to the nut hands they could have on this board. We could all have them, right? So for that reason, you don't want to be putting in too much money just in general. All right, button calls, small blind calls. Now, ace-8 of spades on the jack 8-7 2 clubs. What should we do? Take a second, think about it. Let me know in the comment section down below. Go down there, type it in. What would you do with the ace-8 suited? Click the like and subscribe button while you're down there, please, if you haven't already. This is a spot where we have a very easy fold. It's not even close. You may say, but we're getting great pot odds. If we get an 8, we love it. If we get an ace, we love it. Well, if we get an ace, we don't necessarily love it, because we could easily be against ace-jack or 10-9 or sets. If we get an 8, yeah, we're pretty happy, but again, we could still just randomly be losing. So this is a spot where our outs are not all that clean, and we have no future in this hand if we don't improve. So we only have 5 outs to improve to begin with, and we're out of position. And if we improve, we could still lose. All of this is really, really bad. So we just have to let it go. Fold immediately. We're done with it. We made a pair, check, fold. Sometimes that's how it has to go, especially when it goes bet, call, call. Let's take a look at another scenario. Queen jack suited. In a cash game, $6 raise and call. We call on the button. Jack 8-7, all hearts. Big blind checks. Low jack bets, tiny. Hijack calls. I think this one's a little bit closer than the previous spot, because if we do get a jack or a queen, it's a little bit more likely to be good. That said, Like, if you told me you thought the low jack and the hijack were kind of tight and kind of straightforward, I think folding immediately is fine. With the ace-8 in the previous hand, I think folding is just 100% mandatory. But being in position in a spot where I think you can presume your opponents are going to be kind of passive on the turn unless they have something good, because like the low jack could just be betting into a flush, right? So they're not going to want to be betting too often. This is a spot where I think calling is at least kind of reasonable. Folding would be okay too. Turns a king, low jack bets. If low jack bet $5, I would still just fold. Once the hijack calls, I'm done with it. I'm just totally done with it. When the turn is a bad card for you and your opponents keep betting multi-way, get out of the pot. Get out of the pot. Don't put money in. Just be done. And that is okay. A lot of people hate the idea of putting in money and then just letting the hand go, but realize we were getting good odds on the flop. We were in position. But when they start blasting the turn, especially on a bad card, we are finished. By the way, if the turn was a 2 of clubs instead of a king, I would still fold. If the turn was a 2 of clubs and the low jack bet 30 and the hijack folded, I would still fold on a 2 of clubs. That may sound a little bit nitty because the low jack could be betting with ace high flush draw or king high flush draw, but realize those hands have pretty good equity. And if they have a flush, we have 0%. If they have an overpair, we're drawing pretty thin. And they just have to be worried that the hijack or the button has a very good hand. So this is a spot where if the low jack bets on basically any turn besides a queen or a jack, we're probably going to be done with it. So that is it for today. That is how to play medium strength hands in poker. Remember, you should be paying attention to every hand that is dealt at the poker table so that you can understand how your opponents perceive good, strong poker strategy. Against players who are too tight, for whatever reason, call way less often with your medium strength hands. Against players who are way too loose, call more often with your medium strength hands. And in multi-way pots, you want to be way more cautious. And sometimes you have to ditch hands that would normally be great heads up multi-way because it's just far too easy for someone to have a very good hand. And if it's not you, it's probably one of them. Good luck in your games. Have fun. And I hope you start crushing with your medium strength hands.